The San Diego emergency station was quiet under pale neon lights. The young paramedic, known only as the Quiet One, meticulously restocked her medical bag. A stormy call broke the tense silence. Unresponsive military patient at the harbor dock. Arriving at the dock, they quickly loaded a gravely injured soldier onto the stretcher. She leaned down, focus absolute, checking his pulse with practiced certainty. The soldier's eyes suddenly snapped open, locking onto her face with an unnerving stare. His body trembled. His voice was a ragged whisper. "Fallujah, it's you." The entire crew froze in stunned silence. The quiet paramedic instantly paled. The past she had buried was violently named. Her name was Mira Collins, 30 years old, a frontline paramedic who habitually kept her head bowed when speaking, a gesture of almost practiced invisibility. In the small, tight-knit world of the city ambulance service, she was an enigma. She drove a battered, anonymous sedan, lived in a second-floor studio with blackout curtains perpetually drawn, and her communication with the outside world was strictly utilitarian. Mira sought obscurity like others sought fame. To her team, she was known only for her reticence. She rarely spoke, never shared personal stories, skipped all the obligatory after-shift drinks, and had zero presence on social media. She was a ghost in her own life, a flicker of movement quickly forgotten. This carefully cultivated emotional distance was her most essential piece of survival gear. Her colleagues often murmured judgments in the break room, soft enough not to reach her ears, yet loud enough to define her. "She's good technically, but too timid. Probably hasn't dealt with a real, high-pressure emergency yet." They saw her quiet nature as fragility, her solitude as social awkwardness. Mira never challenged these assumptions. She would offer a slight, almost imperceptible smile and simply return to her duties, allowing their misconceptions to become her shield. Silence was safety, and being underestimated was the luxury she had paid for with years of terror. She possessed an unusual discipline that bordered on obsession. Mira was always the first to arrive, methodically inspecting every piece of equipment, folding each roll of gauze with military precision, not folding, but rolling and securing, the way a soldier would ensure readiness under fire. She arranged every syringe and every airway adjunct with meticulous, almost obsessive order. A young EMT fresh out of training once jested openly, "Why all the intense organizing, Mira? We're going to emergencies, not the paramedic Olympics. Relax a little." Her only reply, delivered without inflection, was, "It is simply what I am accustomed to. Seconds matter, regardless of the patient." The cold finality of the answer discouraged further conversation, allowing her to retreat into the quiet perfection of her routine. Despite her quiet demeanor when facing catastrophic trauma, a multi-car pileup, a factory accident, or a domestic stabbing, Mira was unnervingly calm. Her hands never shook. Her focus was absolute. She moved with an economy of motion that saved seconds, and seconds saved lives. She didn't treat injuries. She fixed them, like a mechanic repairing a complex broken machine. However, this unnatural composure was grossly misinterpreted by her civilian peers. They didn't see deep, disciplined control. They saw cold indifference. They thought she was calm because she was emotionless, lacking the necessary human panic to connect with the gravity of her work. In truth, Mira actively avoided any form of scrutiny. She rented a small, isolated apartment alone, had no digital footprint, and her only personal item was a small, worn photograph of 6 smiling faces, which she kept carefully tucked beneath her trauma shears. These faces, her team, were the only witnesses to the hell she'd survived, and their silence was her greatest comfort. 1 week prior to the night at the dock, the team responded to a devastating motorcycle accident involving complex chest trauma. Mira managed a complex tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung due to chest trauma, in less than 40 seconds. The speed and certainty of her actions were breathtaking, a terrifying display of competence. Another veteran EMT, observing the impossible, non-standard field technique, looked at her suspiciously later. "Who taught you that specific rib taping method? That's not textbook EMT. That's a combat field technique, the kind they teach in specialized units. Mira instantly broke eye contact, averted her gaze to the rain-streaked window of the ambulance, and simply tightened her safety harness, offering no response, allowing the suspicion to hang in the air. She knew the line she walked was perilously thin. Her anonymity was essential. The shame of being the sole survivor, the knowledge that 5 other names were on a memorial plaque because of the chaos she walked away from, made every act of humility necessary. She was hiding not just from attention, but from the memory of the explosion. On the night the event unfolded, she was already on her late shift, the heavy rain outside mirroring the tension she always carried. She found herself counting her own heartbeats, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years, a constant, low-grade fear that the past she'd run was finally catching up, that the quiet life was just a borrowed moment. Then the dispatch call. The metallic voice crackled, reporting a critical, severely injured military patient. Mira stiffened. Civilian patients were routine. Military patients were a link to the past, a dangerous variable. Mira couldn't possibly know that the next 30 minutes, spurred by a single whispered phrase, would violently dismantle the life of anonymity she had spent 8 years constructing, dragging her legend back into the glaring, unforgiving light. The ambulance slid to a halt at the edge of the shipping pier. The scene was chaotic. A small military team was desperately trying to stabilize their injured comrade on the rain-slicked concrete, illuminated by flashing blue and red lights. The soldier lay motionless, his camouflage uniform soaked not just with rain, but with the distinctive telltale color of fine desert sand clinging to the fabric. He was suffering from massive internal bleeding and severe respiratory distress. Mira and her partner Dave rushed the stretcher toward the casualty, but it was Mira who took command without speaking a word. Mira knelt, her mind instantly calculating the severity of his condition, bypassing the civilian protocol steps to go straight for the most critical assessment. Her fingers went straight to his femoral artery, checking the pulse. It was thready, barely present, and her face tightened with professional concern. Her method of palpation was swift, precise, and utterly devoid of hesitation, a technique known only to highly trained combat medics who learn to feel a pulse through layers of gear and chaos. Her partner Dave, a seasoned EMT with 2 decades of experience, suddenly paused, watching her. "Mira, how did you find that pulse so fast? You just went straight for it, didn't waste a second." The question held a new, sharper edge of suspicion than before. Mira ignored him, focusing entirely on the task, shouting instructions to the military personnel to secure the C-spine. There was no time for small talk. There was only life and death, and she was already operating at a different, faster speed than her team. As they gently rolled the patient to secure him to the trauma board, the soldier let out a low, pained moan, and his right hand lashed out, weakly grasping Mira's left wrist, startling her with the sudden, intimate contact. He stared up past the harsh lights and the pouring rain, right into her face. His eyes, though clouded with pain and shock, held a flicker of absolute recognition, a terrifying blend of disbelief, the shock of the dead walking, and immense gratitude. He rasped, his voice hoarse from pain and lung compression. "Fallujah! I know that face. It's you!" The name was a gunshot in the rain, loud and impossible to ignore. Mira froze again, her whole body momentarily rigid beneath the soldier's grip. The world seemed to drop out from beneath the screeching tires of the ambulance, and the rain became a distant, muffled roar. Dave looked from the soldier to Mira, bewildered and increasingly uncomfortable. "Fallujah? What the hell is he talking about? Mira, what does that word mean to you?" He was demanding an answer now, breaking the unspoken rule of silence. The soldier, fighting the urge to slip back into unconsciousness, suddenly gained a moment of desperate clarity. He continued, his voice cracking with intensity. "You pulled me out from the collapsed building, medic. The last one, I thought you were dead, Hunter 1. The young EMT standing by the back door of the ambulance gasped, eyes wide with shock, fumbling with a blood pressure cuff. "Wait, Hunter 1? You were in the Middle East battlefield? You were military, Mira?" Mira did not answer. She simply lowered her chin, trying to hide the tiny tremor in her lower lip, the one visible sign that her iron control was fracturing. She focused entirely on the soldier's arm. "Secure the line now," she commanded, her voice low and dangerously steady, the voice of someone accustomed to being instantly obeyed. Inside the moving ambulance, the tension was unbearable. Mira performed emergency needle thoracostomy to relieve the tension in his chest, a high-risk, life-saving procedure far outside the scope of a standard civilian paramedic. Her movements were startlingly practiced, almost surgical, as if she were stitching a wound onto her own soul. Dave sat back in the jump seat, his initial suspicion replaced by a terrifying awe, mixed with fear of the woman sitting opposite him. "Where did you learn this stuff, Mira? This is deep field trauma medicine. You can't learn this in a city clinic." Mira only answered with the same old, cold evasion. "I worked with a certain team. It was a long time ago." She hated the lie, but the full truth was a nuclear device she dared not unleash. The soldier, now partially stabilized but fading rapidly, struggled to hold her hand one last time. He choked out the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, confirming her worst fear. "You were the sole survivor of the legendary Hunter team. They said the building took all of you." A profound, horrified silence descended upon the cramped space of the ambulance. Dave stared at the old wound on Mira's forearm, comparing it to a memory he barely registered from the news 8 years ago. Mira finally closed her eyes for just 2 seconds, allowing the weight of the lie to crush her. When they opened, the civilian paramedic was gone, replaced by a ghost of a soldier. "Concentrate on the patient," she said, cutting off all further conversation with a single, brutal command. Dave saw the final, undeniable evidence. As Mira quickly pulled up her sleeve to wipe sweat from her forehead, her forearm was exposed for a fleeting second, revealing a long, grotesque, winding scar. The precise, unforgettable wound reported by military media years ago, from the very Fallujah explosion where the Hunter team was supposedly annihilated, and no one survived. Dave realized he had been working beside a ghost for 2 years. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the massive military hospital emergency entrance. Before the doors even opened, a swarm of uniformed personnel rushed out to receive the gravely injured soldier, their focus absolute. The professionalism of the civilian EMT team was instantly dwarfed by the rigid, organized chaos of the military medical corps, a machine built for war-torn injuries. Suddenly, as Mira helped transfer the soldier onto the hospital gurney, a lieutenant, supervising the receiving trauma team, saw her face clearly in the harsh white light of the canopy. He stopped dead, his posture going rigid, his expression turning to shock, his face draining of all color. He whispered the forbidden words, disbelief warring violently with certainty. "Impossible! Hunter 1 is alive? By God, that's her call sign." The lieutenant's stunned reaction instantly drew attention. The ripple effect was immediate. All heads turned toward Mira Collins, the quiet paramedic, the shock rippling visibly through the corridor as the whispered call sign passed from one uniformed person to the next. Then a high-ranking colonel, a figure of imposing authority, draped in service ribbons, emerged from the background, intending to oversee the critical casualty. He looked at Mira, frowned for only a fraction of a second, his brain processing the impossible face before him. Then, in a gesture that stunned every enlisted person present, the colonel snapped immediately to attention, delivering a deep, formal salute that spoke volumes of respect and history. The colonel's voice was loud, carrying down the sterile hallway, thick with emotion and respect. "Mira Collins, the most decorated and supposedly deceased field medic of the Fallujah campaign?" Mira swallowed hard, her voice barely audible amidst the noise of the busy hospital, the anonymity she craved now utterly shattered. "Sir, I am only a regular civilian paramedic now. I just delivered a patient." She desperately wanted to retreat into the comfortable shadow of her civilian life. The colonel lowered his salute, but his eyes remained burning with intense respect. "No, Hunter 1. You are a legend. You are the woman who, over 3 days, single-handedly navigated the complete collapse of Sector 7. You systematically extracted 19 men from the rubble under continuous enemy fire, earning 2 silver stars that were awarded posthumously. A military surgeon overhearing the conversation whispered, his voice full of reverence. We had your name engraved on the memorial wall at command. I thought you were killed during the wall collapse. We held a memorial service, 6 caskets sealed with the flags. Mira looked down at her own hands, the hands that had done so much saving, now feeling impossibly heavy. She said softly, the survivor's guilt a tangible thing. It should have been. I lost the rest of my team. The cost of her survival was etched in the tremor of her voice. The news spread through the hospital corridors like wildfire. Hunter 1 has returned. Soldiers, both enlisted and officers, involuntarily stood straighter, offering silent, respectful nods as she passed. The hallway became a cathedral of quiet reverence. One young, injured soldier, leaning heavily on crutches, approached her, his eyes brimming with tears. Ma'am, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. You are the only reason I am alive today. You patched the shrapnel wound in my leg under mortar fire when I thought I was done. Mira simply shook her head, unable to accept the praise, feeling only the weight of the missing. I was only doing my job, soldier. Your focus needs to be on recovery. The patient from the ambulance was being quickly wheeled toward the operating theater. Just before the heavy double doors closed, he suddenly screamed, his voice raw with desperate conviction, cutting through the hospital air. She saved our entire squad. She is the best medic this corps ever had. Don't let anyone ever call her just a civilian employee again. Mira turned away sharply, closing her eyes, attempting to regain control of the composure that had been her defining feature for so long, wishing she could simply melt into the floor. A young, enthusiastic military doctor followed her to the side, his clipboard forgotten, captivated by the living legend. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? You could be a national icon, Mira. Your story is bigger than the city. Mira looked at him, her gaze clear and unwavering, conveying the agony of her choice. An icon doesn't get to live a quiet life, doctor. An icon is a public figure, always watched. My focus isn't on the war I left behind. It's on the immediate casualties I can still prevent. I want to work where people need me, in the urgent reality of this moment, not where they worship the ghost of who I used to be. She paused, the rain outside echoing her internal turmoil. I didn't run from the enemy. I ran from the noise. Silence is the only place left where I can hear my conscience. The colonel returned, his expression now one of deep seriousness and unwavering respect. He laid a hand on Mira's shoulder, a profound connection between 2 veterans. You have saved more lives and in worse conditions than any doctor I have ever met, Hunter 1. Your civilian team deserves to know the caliber of the woman they stand beside. And today, everyone is going to know that. Mira bowed her head, her eyes burning red from the unshed tears. Her secret was gone, ripped away by the gratitude of a dying man. The burden of her legend was now irrevocably restored, heavier and more powerful than she remembered. Believe in quiet courage, comment, respect. The following morning, the suburban emergency station was buzzing with an electric tension. The story of Mira, the Fallujah legend, was the only topic of conversation. It had spread from the military hospital, through the police and fire networks, and straight into their small command center, amplified by official military chatter. The EMTs who had routinely mocked her, calling her the quiet one, or the timid girl, stood silent, their faces etched with deep regret and self-reproach. The casual disrespect they had shown her now felt monstrously significant, a betrayal of someone who had earned the right to walk in peace. She rescued an entire platoon, one of them whispered to another, staring at the empty chair where Mira usually sat, their voices full of shame. And she let us treat her like a nervous rookie. She just absorbed our ignorance. When Mira finally walked through the doors that morning, she felt the change immediately. There was no more laughter, no more teasing, no more dismissive whispers, only a profound, palpable silence and an almost sacred respect. Every person stopped what they were doing and simply watched her, recognizing the warrior beneath the uniform. The head EMT captain, A gruff, middle-aged man who had always been dismissive stepped forward. He stood before her, his posture straight, not as her boss, but as a humbled equal. Mira, I owe you an apology that words can't truly cover. We judged you based on volume, not on depth. We failed to see your strength, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Mira offered them the soft, genuine smile that none of them had ever seen before. The smile was not of pity, but of shared, weary humanity. We are all the same, she replied gently, her voice steady. We are only human beings trying to save others. Let us simply focus on that. My past doesn't change the job we have today. The shift was instantaneous and total. Her colleagues started seeking her quiet counsel on tough cases. Her advice was taken as gospel, and the respect she was afforded was silent and unwavering, far more meaningful than the loud disdain she had previously endured. That afternoon, the critically injured soldier woke up fully in his recovery room and immediately asked to see the civilian paramedic who had saved him, and years earlier had saved his life in the desert. When Mira entered the room, he was weak and heavily bandaged, but he raised his hand in a slow, perfect military salute, a gesture reserved for officers and heroes. He told her, his voice clearer now, filled with deep gratitude. If it wasn't for you, medic, Fallujah would have been the day we all died. Thank yourself for your continued service. Welcome home, Hunter One. Mira pulled up a chair and sat down, meeting his gaze. The past doesn't matter anymore, soldier. What matters is that you live the life you fought for. Now heal. That is your mission. The news that Hunter One was working in San Diego reached the highest echelons of the regional command. A formal letter of thanks and a comprehensive service recommendation, acknowledging her past heroism and current skill, were immediately dispatched to the civilian emergency station, publicly validating her service and her extraordinary skills for all to see. The entire station now recognized that the quietest person among them was, in fact, the greatest hero. Believe that kindness is the true strength? Comment, honor. 1 week later, Mira received a formal, heavy-stock paper invitation from the Department of Defense. They wanted her to fly to Washington, D.C. to meet with the command staff to officially receive the medals, citations, and honors she had previously been denied or had fled after the Fallujah incident. It was an offer to reclaim her past glory, but Mira politely declined. Her letter, delivered personally to the colonel, stated clearly, I appreciate the recognition, but my mission field is here. I work as a paramedic because I want to save people in my local community, right now, in the immediate present, not for a title or a ceremony that belongs to a ghost. She had found her new, quiet front line, where true impact was measured in immediate action, in the mundane tragedies of civilian life, not historical accolades. Her healing was in the daily grind of saving strangers. That evening, her colleagues organized a small private gathering for her. Not a party, but a simple, heartfelt dinner in the break room to acknowledge her. There were no grand speeches, just pizza and quiet respect. Mira arrived in her standard, worn paramedic uniform. No medals, no old combat fatigues, simply the civilian gear she wore every day. The past was over. This was her reality. The station chief raised a glass to her, his voice thick with sincerity and emotion. Mira, you taught us all something invaluable. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the strongest, and true strength doesn't need to shout. We will never judge a book by its cover again. Mira looked around the small, respectful group, her eyes softening. She finally shared a piece of her soul with them, letting go of the last threads of her isolation. No one should ever be underestimated. We all carry invisible wounds, and we all possess hidden strengths. The only difference is whether we choose to use them. Quietly every day. The entire room stood and applauded, not with the loud, boisterous cheering of a military ceremony, but with a deep, silent, genuine respect that resonated with the quiet integrity of the woman herself. It was the only honor she truly needed. When Mira left the station late that night, the rain had returned, heavy and cold, just like the night she first met the soldier at the harbor dock. But this time, she didn't walk with her head bowed in practiced humility. She walked tall, her posture straight, having finally faced her ghost in the light of day, and the respect of her peers. On her drive home, she whispered to herself, a final closure to the haunting memory. Fallujah is the past. Hunter 1 is retired. And today, this is the life I choose to save, 1 minute at a time. Above the now quiet emergency station, the American flag snapped crisply in the cold night wind, a banner for the quiet heroism that continued every day in the anonymity of the civilian world. If you believe courage still lives in everyday heroes, subscribe to the Veteran Story. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.